Hello, my name is Tiffany Tsui. I'm on the jury team of the Urban Greenhouse Challenge. For the last 20 years, I've focused on green developments in China. I work on diverse fields from green buildings to green cities to metropolitan farming, and I work across cultural and disciplines. And I'm very excited today to give the following presentation to you. Hello, everybody. Dear top 20 teams of the Urban Greenhouse Challenge, congratulations to making to the first round. And the coming month will be a very exciting period because you're going to work out final details. So in the following session, I will give you an introduction about using the study I've done recently on green cities in China. This topic is not only about food production, but it gives a, let's say, the overview of all the related issues relating to green development for China in the last 20 years. In the whole development context of urbanization, all these issues we're talking about, energy efficiency, water management, now increasingly food production, sustainable food supply chains, and healthy well-being, community, and also entrepreneurial ecosystems. These are all interconnected elements relating to what we are addressing today. So also introduction about myself. In these sheets, you see the 9 interconnected elements relating to green city development. From green buildings to smart cities, to metropolitan farming systems, to health and well-being, sustainable supply chains, and also entrepreneurial ecosystem. Let me first introduce you to our site of this competition. On the picture, you will see Mr. Wang and his wife. This is their home. Some pictures, you will see that this is the surrounding of the project. A small piece of farmland surrounded by very densely populated urban areas, factories. As you know, Dongguan has a long history of being the world factories. So you see the site is also surrounded by factories. And on this picture, you see a very simple setup for irrigation system. The water comes from the pond or from the surrounding little river, which is not shown in the picture. When there's no rain, actually, the river water become rather polluted because it's also discharged from the factory. So when there's enough rainwater, actually rainwater is more preferred. It's a more clean source of irrigation. Here you see Mr. Wang is hand packing his harvest for this period. This particular vegetable he produces grows very fast. It's also a very common kind of green veggie called watercress. Doesn't require a lot of fertilizer or pesticide. It grows very easily. Currently, the market pays not so much for his product. He gets about 80 RMB cents, so about 10 euro cents for 1 kilo. And his cost price to produce it is in fact about 1 yuan. So that means it costs him a lot more to produce than to sell it on the market. Then the question is, why does he still do it, of course? Well, if he doesn't produce, then he also loses at least some of the income. But in other times, for example, during Chinese New Year, then his price can be higher. Then in that way, he can try to cover some cost and make some profit during the times when vegetable is not so abundant. But overall, you can see that our Mr. Wang on our current site is not having a very profitable business case. And the question is, why does he do that? And this is a question for you, teams, to ask, why does Mr. Wang, in this very primitive environment with very limited input in technology, in fertilizer, in crop knowledge, not making a lot of money, why is he still able to carry on this activity? So I will come back to this question in a little bit later. So I will show you next business case. This is a case study of Shangshan organic vegetable chain. It is not based in the Greater Bay Area, but in around Shanghai, which is also a densely populated metropolitan region. Shangshan is a brand established since 2015. Currently, it has 130 hectares of greenhouses. So one of the greenhouse is shown in this picture. You will see that it's mostly manual labor. The product's going for the organic labeling, which is the highest certification standard in China. And then the producer produces 120 to 130 varieties. Many different type of vegetables, because in the Chinese diet, especially in vegetables, consumer demands variety. So for a organic brand tailored to high-end consumers, they need to be able to satisfy all the needs. Their product sells to 100,000 high-end, really upper class families in Shanghai, and also the up-and-coming new cities such as Hangzhou and Ningbo. And in these families, their minimum income household is 500,000 RMB. And this is, of course, a very high-end segment. But to show this business case, I am not suggesting that healthy, organic, trustworthy, fresh products can only go for the ultimate, let's say, top of the pyramid. But it's important to understand in the marketplace in China, you have a very wide spectrum of prices and consumer demands. So it's important to think about which segment do you target and what kind of value, what is your value propositions. I come back now to the question I asked you earlier, our Mr. Wong. Why does he able to and continue to do what he's doing in a very primitive vegetable production in our current site? This one of the fundamental reasons comes down to this issue: protected farmland in highly densified megacities. So this map shows the density distribution of cities in China. You will see that the Greater Bay Area, Guangdong, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, this cluster has the highest in China. And this table gives a more accurate description. If you compare built area density, you will see that the Shenzhen Dongguan region has about 13,000 person per square meter. And this is about double of, let's say, the other most densely populated metropolitan regions, such as Tokyo or Paris. Tokyo is about 7,000. And if you look at the percentage of total population in terms of the metropolitan area in proportion to total population, in Tokyo, for example, the Tokyo population about 30% of total. In the Shenzhen Dongguan area, even it already has a lot of people, it only accounts for 2% of the Chinese population. What does this mean? It basically means that such clusters, this Shenzhen Dongguan area, there will be a lot more in China. Conservatively, we can say China will be at least 20 or so of this kind of really densified metropolitan regions. And these type of regions have share a similar characteristic: high population, very limited land. So this is a sheet showing the basic protected farmland policy. It's a very important foundation for Chinese agriculture policy in relation to food security. Here you see different colors, and which represent the square or hectares of protected farmland. In the Chinese law definition, protected farmland means there are no other crops allowed other than what's important for sustenance. For example, corn, of rice, of wheat. So these are important food crops for food security. So in basic farmland, in order to make sure China can be self-sufficient, Chinese government has set a policy to protect the 120 million hectare of basic farmland, and they're distributed all around China. Some region has less. You see in Guangdong province, it's light blue, so it has a lot less protected farmland in comparison, for example, to the northern provinces in Heilongjiang, for example. So this is also a map showing the protected horticulture area in China. And in this sheets, the word protected is different from the protected farmland. In this case, it means basically covered greenhouse area for vegetable production, where you can see most of the Chinese currently for greenhouse vegetable production are mostly concentrated around the northern provinces, and that is around Beijing, around Hebei, around Liaoning, but very limited actually numbers in Guangdong province. So that leads back to Mr. Wang, that he is able to grow crops, very low value crops in Dongguan, which has very high land prices and very high consumer demand. Everything is expensive, is because that piece of land where he is right now cannot do anything else. So because it has a protected farmland status, it's not allowed, for example, to have aquaculture. It's not allowed to build houses for a factory. So it becomes only in some ways reserved area in a very densely populated area. But obviously, this type of business model cannot continue. For Mr. Wang's, he needs education, he needs to have a better income, he needs to have better protection for his family, and also he needs to provide for his children. So he needs to actually, in the next, when our project get developed, Mr. Wang's and other his fellow growers from other provinces, they need to be supported in knowledge, education, in crop knowledge, but also their products need to be much better value. So that piece of land they have now, they need to be able to, on the one hand, preserve the farmland status, but same time upgrading its production facilities and value creation. So what's driving the consumer market and also consumption behavior? It's very important to understand what's going on in the marketplace. And again, today, compared just with about, let's say, 4 months ago, I think we're witnessing a dramatic, even more dramatic marketplace transformation. We talk about digital transformation of marketplace. In China, this e-commerce online platforms has been developing rather quickly in the last 3 to 5 years. E-commerce giants like Alibaba or Jingdong, and also a lot of up-and-coming fresh platforms are growing rapidly. Consumers are much more used to shopping online, but even just compare with 4 months ago, fresh remains a let's say, lagging behind sector, because most of the Chinese consumers, 80% of them, are still used to shopping, going to the traditional wet market. As we all know, that changed drastically. And this dramatic change is not just happening in China. This force upon us transformation is also happening in Europe right now. So in my sheets here, I also looked at the consumption pattern shift driven by income and e-commerce, which you will see that in the next 5 years, Chinese consumers will have a major shift in income class. And the biggest shift is not people becoming, let's say, the upper richest consumer, like in the case of the organic vegetable. In Shanghai, they are, let's say, really the top of the pyramid. This top of the pyramid consumer that actually not driving the biggest changes. The biggest changes are going to come from consumers that currently are in the lower middle class, let's say in tier 3 cities, lesser income, lesser education. But in the next 5 to 10 years, they are rapidly becoming, let's say, upper middle class. And this rising upper middle class shift we're talking about 200, 300 million Chinese consumers. And what they are now, especially now drastically improved, speed up by the virus situation, is to demand for healthy, fresh product, food especially, that's good for health. So in an earlier study, we also see that this type of consumer preference for healthy products and willingness to pay for them actually is not so different anymore compared to tier 1, 2, 3 cities. Actually, this chart actually shows consumers in the lesser developed cities are actually willing to even pay even more. And then we foresee this demand will even become more dramatic. If we look at what makes consumer pay for high-value product, one important aspect is product standard. Currently, Chinese market has, let's say, two main categories of product certification. That is green product and that's organic product. And on this sheet, you will see the different requirements in terms of their consumer acceptance. In a survey being done to Chinese consumers, you will see that food safety is ranked very, very high in terms of consumer when they pick out products. So product certification or branding are part of that story of what makes consumer trust what they buy from the supermarket. So in the very beginning, when we discussed the two business cases, I talked about the wide spectrum between value propositions. From the very low-end wet market model, a lot of product crowding the marketplace, to the very high-end organic labeled, sold through very exclusive channel that can be direct to consumers, delivered to their houses, or being sold in high-end supermarket. In that, you have on these sheets, it shows there's a very big price differences. We can be talking about at least 5 to 10 times. For example, in the Shangshan organic vegetable case, their products being sold directly with apps and their own offline shops costs at least 5 times of what would you buy in supermarket, which is already much higher than if you buy them in the wet market. So especially in the healthy category, products should be trusted to be not harmful for health, but also functional, then also good for the environment. But what makes consumer trust that what they buy, the product claiming to have all this benefit, is indeed what they are? In China, we see track and trace is growing very quickly, precisely because, one, consumer demand for trust product. Secondly, on the market, there's still a very limited basis for consumer to pay for that trust. And here this sheet shows some other factors that gives consumer trust. For example, whether products are produced in high-tech big farms, whether it has organic labeling, whether it's sold in more high-end stores, whether it has international third-party certification in terms of cold chain transport or in terms of origin. So these are all the important factors that also captures, let's say, the value of consumer trust. With the rapid development of digitization, a very important issue is there's a lot of possibilities. And this field of, for example, autonomous growing in track and trace, in blockchain, is going to grow very quickly in China and worldwide. But very important to think about is how does this digital technology will enhance the consumer trust. So in last sessions, we talked about business cases, we talked about the consumer trends, also the big drivers shaping the marketplace. Next, I want to talk about ecosystem because we want to build a viable business model. We want to have entrepreneurs to take on capturing these business cases. We need trained staff. We need also students, businesses, academics, research, and policymakers together to continuously make a long-term ecosystem so that the sector for urban farming will continue to grow. In my sheet here, I showed the Dutch horticulture cluster and ecosystems. What you see is ecosystem, the chain, the technology. There are different players at different niche, at different segment, different functions. So these complete pictures, based on a study of how does the Dutch horticulture cluster works, shows that there's a very diverse, complete chain from seed to growing to transport to logistics to consumer market, supported by a very dynamic technology sector and supported by an ecosystem of banks, education, research institute, and student trainings. And important to also think about when we are transferring a planning approach, a novel way of producing food using existing well-developed knowledge, how do we then apply this knowledge in a complete different context, very, very different driving factors, but also cultivating ecosystem based on the local context. So how do we solve this dilemma? And one, for example, in a business case, the lighting is a very important aspect of urban farming because we want to, as much as possible, keep the unfavorable climate condition outside. So the humidity, the heat. So indoor farming, in fact, provides a very good medium to do that. So that means we need to use a lot of light. And Shenzhen and the surrounding regions, for example, Dongguan and Zhongshan, produce a large proportion of world light fixture. A lot of LED lights are already produced in the region. So that gives actually a very strong basis for the supporting technology industry. And how our projects in Dongguan can marry, let's say, the crop knowledge, the food production technology with the new technology, as mentioned, in drones, in lighting, to make a, let's say, a viable, economically viable and an attractive business model. In this session, we looked at different business cases. We looked at what's driving the marketplace, what's driving Chinese consumers, what do they want. We talked about the entrepreneurial ecosystem. As a conclusion, I think we are at a very challenging but also very exciting times, especially when we're talking about sustainable, circular, and urban food production to bringing food back into people's lives. I think, again, we are experiencing events that didn't expect, they were even unthinkable a few months ago. But this topic on health and on a personal level, taking care of your own health, your own family, is of course becoming a top agenda for everybody. But on a macro level, it's also important, again, to remind ourselves we are not all individuals on ourselves. Our individual health is also dependent very much on the global ecosystem health. You can also say the biodiversity losses, climate change. These are issues are reflected very real now in a very dramatic way, affecting our day-to-day individual lives. Our world, our business are turned upside down overnight. And technology and transformations are not always nice words, because actually as human beings, we probably do not want to have to transform our lives completely so quickly. But sometimes transformation happens not because we chose to do it slowly, implement it step by step, because they are forced upon us. And for that, we can look forward and join hands, and also to really work together as global community. So, conclusion, good luck, teams, and I look forward to your questions.